back to our review videos. We're getting close, guys. Only another week until our AP exam starts up. So again, don't forget, Monday, May 18th, 4 p.m. is our exam. By 3:30, you need to have that admission ticket clicked in order to start the process up. There should be that little yellow box on there. Click that. It will ask you a series of security questions. And don't forget, once you open that, don't click refresh, back button, any of those things. It needs to stay open. The test will automatically start. So without further ado, we're going to start into Unit 6 review, which is energy resources and consumption. So the first thing you need to know is the difference between a renewable resource and a non-renewable resource. Renewable resources are those ones that are going to replace themselves naturally. They're going to replenish the amount naturally, and they're going to replenish at or near the rate of usage. If we're using them appropriately and sustainably, they're always going to be available to us. Things like wood products and fresh water and clean air, those are all renewable resources. When we talk about renewable energy resources, those are the energy resources that are going to replenish themselves naturally, in a fairly quick manner. Wood products, as long as we're using them sustainably, hydroelectric, wind power, solar power, all those things would be renewable energy sources. When we look at non-renewable, those are the ones in fixed amount. It's going to take them a lot longer to replace. Those are the ones that's really, really difficult for them to replace themselves. Fossil fuel energy, for example. That's going to be a one and done. It's going to be hundreds of thousands of years before we see new fossil fuels form. And they're replacing in such small amounts, we don't have new ones coming back to us instantly. We're using up the resources, and it's taking, again, that 100,000-year process. It's not like instantly 100,000 years from now we're going to have more of those. They're replenishing in a very, very small amount, but it's such a small amount, it's nowhere near the usage rate that we have. So there is going to be no replacing of them. They're once and done because of that. So when we look at these energy resources also, we have to differentiate between more economically developed and less economically developed countries, because that's going to affect not only usage, but also demands and things like that. So when we look at it, first off, they're not equally distributed between the MEDCs and LEDCs. It's not like we have all the rich countries having all the fossil fuels, all the poor countries not having them. Wealth tends to distribute, in those countries that do have them available, but you have to have the means to be able to extract them. In a lot of those countries, there's deposits underground, but they don't have the infrastructure necessary to extract them from the ground. And because of that, those ones are going unused. They are potential sources for them, but they're unused because we don't have the ability to get to them. So when we look at the usage, that's where we link the economy to it a little bit more. Fossil fuel energy, that's our most widely used source of energy. And again, the fossil fuels include oil, coal, and natural gas. So when we look at those are the most widely used across the planet. We don't have very much usage yet of the renewable energy sources. We're still geared more towards those non-renewables. But as we start to see different changes happen, that's when we're going to start altering our usage and shifting towards those. And down here at the bottom is one of those big things with it, government regulation. Availability, price, and government regulation are going to determine what type of resource you use and how it's used. So when we look at that, right now, the United States government, for instance, is subsidizing the fossil fuel economy. So those fossil fuel companies have lobbyists that go to Congress. They try to influence laws and legislation to be in favor of the fossil fuel industry. So we're subsidizing the coal industry right now, for instance. We're giving the coal companies money so that they're extracting that coal from the ground to boost our economy. Coal usage, though, is going down because we're seeing how dirty of a burning coal it is, or how dirty of a burning fuel source it is. In our country, we're seeing its usage go down. Some of the less economically developed countries, though, are still using it extensively. So if we have government regulation, which we have in our country, limiting the amount of pollution that's created, that's going to drastically affect how much of those fossil fuels we're using as well. In addition, you could have subsidies going towards the gasoline that's produced because it's a strategic resource. But the big ones, again, not only government regulation, but also availability and price. As we start to see less and less fossil fuel availability, the price is naturally going to climb. Right now, we're in a situation where gasoline is really cheap in America, but it's not cheap when you compare it backwards in time. When I was your age, gasoline was 99 cents a gallon. And that wasn't too long ago. It was only a matter of like 15 years ago, uh, maybe 20 years now. I'm getting a little older. But 20 years ago, gasoline was only 99 cents a gallon. But in that 20-year time frame, we've used so much of it that the oil underground that we refine into gasoline, it's becoming scarcer and scarcer. The more scarce an item gets, the more the value goes up. So because of that, we're pricing ourselves out of using these non-renewable fuel sources, which is a good thing for the environment, but a bad thing for our economy because, as we start having to pay more and more for fuel costs, the cost of goods and services go up as well because say the person that's mowing your grass, he has to transport all of his equipment into your lawn, pay for the fuel to run it, and that builds up. So, he might have charged $30 to cut your lawn before, but now it's up to $80. So all that's affecting the economy and making life a little bit more difficult. So we need to be able to start turning away from those fossil fuels that are non-renewable and start turning towards those renewable energy sources that are going to be able to be more in abundance and cheaper for us once the technology gets there. The other thing you want to always link this to is that transition through the demographic transition model. As a country goes from being pre-industrial and it starts to progress and become an industrialized society and its GDP is starting to increase, the fossil fuel usage goes way up as well. So you can tie, when you look at that demographic transition model, remember how we had, the birth rates had this trend, the death rates saw this trend, and then the population as a whole saw kind of like that logistical curve. So when we look at the stages of that demographic transition, as we progress through those different stages, we end up seeing drastic changes in how much fossil fuel energy we use. Since fossil fuel usage is the most widely used energy source, as a country gets more and more money, they can afford to buy more of the fossil fuel energy. They can also afford to extract it from their region if they have it available to them. So because of that, we see its usage go way up. The big energy sources. Again, wood is not a non-renewable. Wood is considered to be renewable provided we're using it wisely. If we're using it at or below the rate of replacement, then it's going to be a renewable resource. In many parts of the world, we end up with reduction in forested land because we're over consuming the wood products. And in the less economically developed countries, it's going to be mainly, again, typo, I apologize, this is going to be mainly for firewood and charcoal. Since those are energy sources, those people can't determine how much they need. They need that as their sole source of energy, so they're not going to worry about deforestation as much. They're going to go cut the trees down and either create charcoal with it or burn it as straight firewood. So they're going to continually cut trees down. They're cutting them down faster than they can be replaced. And we're seeing these rings of deforestation happening around the population centers. So if this is our population center here, and it's a less economically developed country, we see these rings of deforestation happening where they cut down all the trees in the area. And they're cutting them down so quickly that the trees aren't able to regrow. So those rings of deforestation end up expanding out past that population center. The other types of energy sources we have, again, the big non-renewables are coal, oil, and natural gas. So the coal, don't forget, there's three types: lignite, bituminous, and anthracite, and it's dependent on how much heat and pressure they were released to. Anthracite had the longest exposure, the highest heat and highest pressure. That way it pushes out all those impurities. So coal, again, terribly polluting form of energy, but anthracite is the cleanest of the coals. It has the lowest sulfur content. Then we get bituminous, where it's exposed to heat and pressure, but not as much as the anthracite. So not as much of the water and not as much of the sulfur has been removed from that coal. So this is a more dirty burning coal. And the bituminous is the most abundant type of coal we have. Lignite, again, least clean form. A lot of sulfur in it, a lot of water, which makes it produce a ton of particulate matter, a lot of sulfur dioxide, and things like that. And again, it's all based on how much heat and pressure and for how long. So the longer it's exposed to the heat and pressure, the more likely you are to see anthracite. So because of that, different areas have different types of fuels available to them due to the geology of their area. We have mountains in our area that really put a ton of pressure on the organic material, squeezing out all those impurities. That's why we have anthracite in our region. But other areas don't have that same geology behind it, and they're bituminous coal producers or lignite coal producers. Texas, for instance, fairly flat, not many mountains in it, so they end up having more lignite type of coal in Texas. China, again, more bituminous. They have mountains and hills, but not nearly as many of the large mountains that we have, and not so much those granite mountains that we end up seeing. In addition to that, we have natural gas. Natural gas is our cleanest fossil fuels, and it's mainly in the form of methane. And that's because, again, it's a gaseous compound, so those pollutants aren't trapped within it as much. It's kind of like a natural filter for it in that gas phase. As the gases evaporate off and vaporize off, we're getting a more pure form of energy out of it. And again, if we're going to use fossil fuels, natural gas is what we should be turning to. And we're seeing more and more of that happen. There's propane-powered buses. Propane's a form of natural gas. There's propane-powered vehicles right now. You see liquefied natural gas cars everywhere. You're starting to see more and more gas stations carry LNG or liquefied natural gas. The other thing we have is crude oil. And again, crude oil is what we're dependent on primarily. We use it for gasoline. We use it for all of our petroleum products. And we're getting that not just from wells, but also from tar sands. Canada has huge tar sands deposits. And what it is, it's kind of a gloppy mixture of clay, sand, water, and a compound called bitumen. Bitumen is where the oil is trapped in. So what they have to do is extract that tar sand out of the ground, then pass steam through it. As it heats up with that steam, that's going to liquefy that bitumen and cause it to flow out of the sand. That allows them to extract the oil and then refine it down. Now, the problem with that is it consumes huge amounts of water. A lot of energy has to go into the system, so it's a really heavily polluting type of energy extraction. In addition, since you have to dig all of that sand out, you're destroying entire tracts of ecosystem. Canada has the boreal forest. A lot of those tar sands are under the boreal forested land. So we're seeing deforestation, we're seeing habitat destruction, altering of waterways because we're over consuming water. All those different environmental impacts are connected to those tar sands. So we need better ways to use these energy resources. And one of the improved efficiency methods is something called cogeneration. Cogeneration is where the power plants are going to generate electricity by burning these fossil fuels and spinning turbines, which spin generators, which create the electricity. But in addition to spinning that turbine, they're also going to use that heat that's normally just vented out up into the atmosphere. They're going to use that heat to heat the buildings as well. So it's a way to improve your efficiency. Now we're not burning fossil fuels to heat our buildings. We're heating the buildings as we're producing the electricity. And that's what cogeneration is all about. It's a way to drastically improve the efficiency of these fuel usage ways. So when we talk about how we get our electricity, if it's a thermal form of electricity, and again, thermal forms are any fossil fuel energy, oil, coal, natural gas used for electricity, or nuclear as well, because nuclear harnesses heat as well. So when we look at the thermal electricity generation, we burn the fuel, or again, use the heat from the fission process. That heat energy is what we're using to create the electrical current. We're going to transfer that kinetic heat energy into kinetic electrical energy. And we're going to do that through a series of steps. So the first thing that happens is we burn the fuel source or allow it to undergo fission. That heat that's generated creates steam, and the steam is a form of kinetic energy. That kinetic energy, again, we're taking the chemical energy contained, the potential energy contained within the fuel source, first creating it into thermal energy, which is a form of kinetic. Then that kinetic thermal energy is creating steam. That kinetic thermal steam then spins the turbine. So what you need to know is, again, you're going to burn the fuel, you're going to create steam. That steam then spins the turbine. The turbine is connected to the generator. So as the turbine is spinning, the generator is also rotating. As that generator is rotating, that's what's passing the magnets around that copper coil of wire, generating the electrical current that we use for our electricity. So you need to know this process and understand how it's working. Again, it's a four-step process. You have to create heat. Once the heat is created, it generates steam. Steam turns the turbine spins the generator, creating the electrical current. So that's any form of thermal electricity generation. But thermal electricity generation, again, not the only type of electricity generation. We'll get to that once we talk about renewables. So where do we get these different thermal sources of fuel from? So when we look at the coal, we get it primarily from mining. If it's close to the surface, again, within, probably 100 feet or even 100 meters of the surface, we're going to do strip mining for, surface mining for it. If it's more than that 100-meter depth, then we start getting into subsurface mining. Or if we know that there's huge veins of coal running under mountain ranges, we can actually blow the top of the mountain up, push the rock over the side of the hill, and then extract the coal from that. That's the mountaintop removal process. So you guys need to know, again, coal is gained by mining, either surface or subsurface. For oil, we're going to drill wells into the ground and pump it to the surface, or we're going to process those tar sands. With natural gas, again, we can dig wells directly into the ground rock formations and get the natural gas up. Or if the natural gas is trapped within rock itself and it's not concentrated in big pockets, we can use what's called hydraulic fracturing or fracking. That's where you pump pressurized water mixed with a bunch of chemicals. Those chemicals help to weaken the rock. The pressure then cracks the rock and the natural gas seeps up to the surface where it's captured. If it's nuclear, we're going to mine for that. And for nuclear mining, for uranium mining, that's going to be the subsurface type of mining, open pit or with the old mine shafts and things like that. The uranium is going to be enriched then to up the amount of 235. Uranium-235 is our fissionable form of uranium. That's what we're looking for. Naturally occurring uranium, though, doesn't have much uranium-235 in it. So we need to enrich it to add, the amount of uranium-235 that's present. Once we get it up to a fissionable range, then we can use that within our nuclear power plants. So when we look at nuclear, what happens with it? It's a little bit different. It's not burning uranium. Instead, it's undergoing that fission process. And that's where you have a nucleus of uranium. A neutron comes in, hits that nucleus, and splits it off into two parts. As it splits into two pieces, that's the fission process. In addition to the two pieces going off, there's 3 more free neutrons that go flying away. Those 3 free neutrons hit more uranium nuclei. As it hits those nuclei, it creates that chain reaction and huge amounts of heat are released. That heat, again, is harnessed. It creates steam. The steam turns the turbine, which spins the generator, which creates the electricity for us. But when we start using this fissionable material, the uranium, it's highly radioactive. It causes cancers, it causes radiation poisoning, all those things. So we need to do it in a safe way. The reaction has to happen under a completely sealed environment. Usually they put a giant cement case over top of the nuclear reactor to ensure none of that radiation goes out into the environment. The water they use is in a completely sealed system. The radioactive water is held within the power plant and never allowed to get released into the environment. But the waste products also, that uranium doesn't last forever. We have those fuel rods and they go bad after a while. The amount of uranium-235 continually goes down because we're constantly causing fission, and the fission is splitting that uranium into smaller isotopes that are radioactive as well. The radioactive nature of that waste makes it so that it has to be stored for long periods of time. And a lot of times, the amount of half-lives it has to go through before it's safe takes hundreds of thousands of years to occur. So they store it in a couple different ways. The first way is that it's stored directly on site at the reactor site. They do that because that radioactive material is really, really hot. So it has to get a chance to cool off and make it so that we can safely store it and package it without that fission process still occurring. So once it's down to that safe temperature, then we can put it into cement and lead-lined containers that don't allow that radiation to get out and transport it for long-term service. And remember that piece of legislation that we had, that cradle to grave legislation, Resource Conservation and Recovery Act. That's that cradle to grave monitoring of it. We have to register every bit of uranium that we mine for. We have to understand where it's at all times, how it's being transported, and then also recover it at the end and store it long term. The government oversees all that. The big repository for nuclear waste storage is the Yucca Mountain Reserve. So I don't know that they'll ask that, but that's something you can tie it to. What they did was they dug this lengthy tunnel down into the bottom of a mountain. It's surrounded by tons and tons and tons of granite. And since it's so deep underground, even if an earthquake would hit or other countries launch nuclear bombs at us, that still is going to be protected long term. So that uranium and other radioactive material, whether it's from weapons or whether it's from nuclear power plants, gets stored underground for long, lengthy times. I think I'm going to stop there. We'll come back into the renewables in our next video.